welcome.
大家早上好 Very good morning. For this panel, we have 3 papers. The first presenter, we're going to change the order a little bit. So we're going to start with Professor Syed Muhammad Khairuddin Al-Junid as the first paper, and then move to Professor Frank Don's paper, and then Professor Shen Yuan Chao's paper. All right, that sort of order would actually flow better in terms of logic and in terms of the topic. So let me introduce Professor Syed Muhammad Khairuddin Al-Junid. He's an associate professor at the National University of Singapore, and also professor and Malaysia Chair of Islam in Southeast Asia at Georgetown University in Singapore. Unfortunately, Khairuddin is not able to join us this morning, but I understand that he will take up a visiting professorship here in a couple of weeks' time. So he has asked Frank, who has kindly agreed to present on behalf of him. So his topic is on overcoming the wide-ranging effects of mass violence in Singapore, 1950 to 1945. Frank, please.
Okay, thank you.
So Khairuddin basically asked me to
if I could present his paper. So when I received his PowerPoint slides, I noticed that they were very mini PowerPoint slides. So his topic is actually about his title is Overcoming the Wide Range Effects of Mass Violence. And he's talking about a case in Singapore that happened in the 50s. It's quite a famous case called the Maria Hertog riots. Khairuddin, basically, the blue part is Khairuddin and the black is what I added to his PowerPoint. So basically he talks about a legal case involving a Dutch Muslim girl called Natra or Maria Hertog. Some people say Bertha Hertog. And then the British court rules that she was to be given back to her parents. So as a result of that, Muslims went on a riot, killing 18 people and injuring hundreds of others. A little bit more details that I've added is she was born in 1937 on Java and was originally Roman Catholic. So what happened was that her father, who worked for the military, a Dutch military, was imprisoned during the Japanese occupation. And a friend of her mother, the friend is called Amina binti Muhammad, she took care of Maria. The wife of, the mother of Maria Hertog, called Nor Louise, she was interned by the Japanese. And then she claimed that actually Amina did not return her child to her. So it became an issue. Amina renamed the child Nadra binti Marov, and Amina worked a while for the Japanese, and then in 74 she decided to go back to her hometown in Terengganu in Malaysia to protect the child, with the child of course being white. In 49, the Hertog family then managed to locate their daughter, and in April 1950, they met in Singapore. And although the girl wanted to stay with Amina, who had taken care of her since she was born, the decision was to take her away anyway. A legal appeal was issued, and Maria or Nadra was given to Amina. Then Nadra quickly married to Mansur Adabi, a husband of 22 years old, according to Muslim law, Islamic law. This of course complicated matters because now it was an issue where many parties started to get involved, since you had an issue of Islamic ruling, Islamic law, and at the same time you also had a child that custody law. Basically, the court in Singapore ruled that the conversion could only be legal if it was authorized by the father because the child was underage. And marriage was only allowed from the age of 16, according to Dutch law, and Maria or Nadra was still under Dutch law since she was a child of Dutch parents. As a result of that, the father would not have authorized both the marriage and the conversion. And because of that, the child should go back with the parents to the Netherlands. But of course, the child itself, Maria, was of course raised by Amina, and she didn't want to go back. So that created a huge problem. The authorities, during the time of the appeal, brought Maria to a convent. Then that was actually done to prevent the Dutch parents from taking Maria away. So the child was put in a convent until the appeal was decided in December. And the press showed a lot of these pictures of Maria unhappy in the convent. And when the appeal was finally rejected, it sparked riots. 18 people were killed, 7 Europeans, 2 police officers and 19 rioters. And a lot of Europeans and Eurasians were targeted by the Malay population. So later, several people were convicted for the riots, and after some political pressure from Malaysia, there's a dimension there of a change of ruler. 5 were condemned. So they were not hanged, but they were given life sentences. So I've expanded a bit on the Khairuddin's. So here you can see some of these demonstrations against the verdict and not against the court. And this would be better. Good. And here also you can see some of these cars being set on fire, and several people were very badly beaten, and many died. So Khairuddin's paper argues that there has been a lot of research done on the actual causes of the riots, and these all look at the situation in Singapore itself. So he argues that although this research on the riots in the society of Singapore, there is a shortcoming of scholarship, which is the larger implications and effects have not been taken into account. So in the event that the aftermath of ethnic riots are ever discussed, let alone examined systematically, these studies are for the most part concerned with the post-conflict reconstruction, which includes localized attempts at reconciling feuding groups, state restorations and ravaged societies, and the implementation of preventive measures through recommendation of truth commissions. So the picture that emerges from the sum of the total of such studies is that such conflict have had little impact beyond their restrictive settings. And he wants to go against that and look a little bit more at the, why is it not, oh, look at this. Anyway, so there's a preoccupation with causes of the riots. It's mostly descriptive rather than analytic, and it's couched against the backdrop of the making of nation states. And the paper by Khairuddin, which you can actually read, I recommend you read it, it's much more detailed, goes beyond that. And he looks at a work by Michael Hill, stating Maria Hertog case has become something of an icon in Singapore state's presentation of religious strife in its history, and has been revisited on a number of occasions as an instance of the destabilizing potential of religious conversion. So framing and reframing, the idea that Khairuddin has is to rescuing history from the nation, going beyond the nation, looking at the British Empire in an age of decolonization, and also arguing that the riots were an upshot of colonial neglect. And then he also says that Britain's image and relationship with the Muslim world was put into question. So the most complex and yet spontaneous responses to, and then he investigates all sorts of external points of view, looking at those riots in Singapore. So he looks at the outside looking in. The responses come from Muslims in mainland Malaya, South Thailand and Indonesia, which is of course unsurprising given the long historical and familial ties between the Muslim communities in Singapore and their brethren in other parts of Southeast Asia. Migratory flows in and out of Singapore following the re-establishment of British rule on the island have of course invigorated community networks and social ties that were broken through, during Japanese occupation. Those groups greatly affected by the events that unfolded were the Muslim members of the security forces. So they were reported to be troubled by their commitment to defend the colonial state against communists after having witnessed what they regarded as an unfair treatment of their co-religionists in the realm of colonial laws. Communists, of course, predictably quickly capitalized on this state of affairs by attempting to widen the split between the colonial state and the uniformed security personnel. And after more than 2 years of failed ideological campaigns since the declaration of the Malayan emergency in 1948, communists now finally found an issue that could be used to say that the British were unfair to Muslims. So basically he's stating that use of this issue was used by the communists in order to create a rift between Muslims and the British state. So in Kelantan, voices that appealed for moderation were drowned out by a rapid escalation of anti-British feelings. Those sentiments were amplified by several radical groups. And one example is a band of 20 young men in Kota Baru who actually had an objective to kill Europeans involved in the Maria Hertog case. So supporters were actually not too numerous, about 80, and but some of them actually had some stature, like for instance Mustafa bin Mahmud, the brother-in-law of the chief minister of Kelantan. Looking at Indonesia, President Sukarno also jumped on the bandwagon and referred to the Maria Hertog case as another serious political blunder of the West. Muslims in Indonesia, President maintained, regarded the marriage between Maria Hertog and Mansur Adabi as valid, although she was only 13 years old at the time. British court's decision to nullify the marriage had brought about worldwide Muslim resentment toward Britain, which would not be easy to mediate or resolve. And then there was also an appeal to Muslim organizations, India, Burma, Philippines, and Indonesia to apply pressure on the British against the suppression of Muslims in Singapore and mainland Malaya. This stance was then supported by radical youth movements who were bent upon forwarding their grievances about Britain's suppression of nationalist movements to the United Nations. So this is basically the argument of Khairuddin that this case was used politically by the various parties to criticize the old order, and it went beyond the case itself. The UMNO president, Dato' Om bin Jafar, tried to assuage Muslim rage, but this resulted in decline of political support. So all the moderate voices were basically put under pressure or suppressed or criticized for that. A majority of Malays in Singapore, actually, if you look at what happened, had shown great courage by sheltering Europeans and Eurasians from the mob trying to attack them. So religious teachers and ulama in Malaya convened countrywide meetings to discuss various means by which Islamic laws and the rights of Muslims as colonial subjects could be safeguarded, although they unanimously agreed that the Maria Hertog controversy had wide implications upon the religious life of Muslims in Southeast Asia. But major splits developed between the ranks or within the ranks of the Muslim laity in regard to the validity of the marriage and her conversion to Islam. Like I mentioned, so she was only 13 years old, which was actually too young, and the conversion to Islam was also not authorized by her father, since she was not allowed to make decision. In the Arab world, Arabs in the Hadramaut region made effective use of the links with the Middle East that had been revived to promote the interests of the Muslim community in the island at the time. The British were anticipating adverse statements from state authorities and Muslim organizations in Cairo following the quelling of the riots. Those responses would have had an effect on other Muslim majority countries, but much to their relief, the leaders of the Arab countries refrained from expressing any views related to the Maria Hertog case. Because the British, of course, with their world empire, were worried that in the other areas that they had some power in, would cause controversy there. Speaking to news agencies in his country, the Prime Minister of Pakistan declared that the marriage of the 14-year-old Maria was valid from the perspective of Islam, with or without the consent of her non-Muslim parents, and he was reacting to the visit to Pakistan of an Indian Muslim who wanted government officials in Karachi to protest against the draconian laws used by the British to intimidate their subjects in Singapore. The time leading up to the World Muslim Conference was the disquieting period for the British. From 9th of January to the 12th, 1951, Muslim World Conference proceeded as planned, and there were various informal sessions held by Muslim leaders of various nationalities and affiliations. The consensus reached at the end of the conference was that the Muslim world should be a third and unified coalition in the face of the dominance of the communist and socialist capitalist blocs. Several other resolutions were passed, but nothing was referred to the Maria Hertog case. So the Foreign Office and the colonial authorities were very relieved, but also a bit puzzled that this issue was not exploited more. Muslim students, the younger generation Muslim students in London, however, they established the Bertha Hertog Committee to win support in the appeal case and to agitate for an inquiry. So the riots in Singapore also provided difficulty for the conservatives in Britain. They found fault with the Labour government's management of the colonies. The Labour Party was tinged with political divisions, personal rivalries, and a spate of resignations. Contrast to the situation in England, the Netherlands were, of course, triumphant or happy, but although a bit cautious also about the child being returned there. So this is all things I added to Khairuddin's presentation. It's only Malaysia and Indonesia, Pakistan, Egypt, and Europe. So I've explained it a bit more in detail that these various groups react. British strategies in restoring order, surveillance, obtaining intelligence regarding subversive elements in order to crush them. Also propaganda. What did the British do? Well, they tried to show that the colonial state respected Muslims and Islam. And concluding then, I read Khairuddin's conclusion. The significance of the mass violence that broke out in Singapore in December 50 was found not so much in the lies it claimed in the wide-ranging responses by the regional and global communities, as well as the structural vulnerabilities of the colonial system. By viewing a case of collective violence through the lens of the outside in, the bundles of relationships and the complex web And framing the event against the global climate of decolonization, we can see that resistance towards the colonial administration remained intense following the quelling of mass violence, as was manifested in various forms of Southeast Asia and the wider Muslim world. Colonial government was able to anticipate and cope with the threats by tapping into the global information order. Through a policy of appeasement, concession, the British quickly regained the trust of the subjects and diplomatic partners. Propaganda and a public show of respect for Muslims became effective tools in averting resistance in the aftermath of the riots. And then underlying those strategies were the crucial roles played by the selected officials and politicians in London and the outlying colonies and the support of various local personnel organizations which aided in the process of recovery and conciliation. I'll skip that part. That's basically the conclusion by Khairuddin, where he argues that it's important for colonial regimes to implement these multifaceted strategies and policies to retain the initiative. The strength of the past that emerged from this method of analyzing right is thus one that is more analytic, if not more comprehensive, a history that brings together the roles of the colonized, the colonizer, and even those who existed beyond the imperial system into a single framework of analysis. And I will end here. Thank you very much.
Good. No. Thank you very much, Frank. Well, Frank is going to present his own paper now. Let me just introduce Frank, Professor Frank Dorn properly. Professor Dorn received his PhD in history at Yale, and he has been convening the International Indonesian Forum for many years, which he founded. Yep. And Frank and I used to be colleagues in University of Brunei Darussalam, so we know each other a very long way. And Frank is going to present on politics and religion, the use of religious violence in colonial and post-war Indonesia.
Thank you, Ryan. All right. So when I joined this conference, I was thinking, how could I contribute to this topic? So the title is Religion, Violence, and Multiculturalism. And I personally was more interested, because of my study of Indonesia, in the use of violence and the religious motives behind that. So I tried to look at Indonesia, and I tried to see over the historical evolution of Indonesia. I tried to look at the way violence is used and how that changes. And we can see some evolution. Basically, looking first at Indonesia, of course, I just put a map there for people who are not so familiar with Indonesia. The Dutch controlled the region of the Dutch East Indies that we now know as Indonesia, and gradually captured that. The concept that I will use, or the question that I will ask is, can we see some kind of evolution, or some kind of, is there some kind of change over various episodes of violence in Indonesia that I will take as case studies? So is there anything there that we can conclude? So the first picture that I have here is the Indonesian representation of a national hero called Diponegoro. And you can see him very fiery portrayed on his horse, or also very wisely portrayed as a serene leader. The Dutch portrayal of Diponegoro is this person here, gentleman here from that picture, is when he is captured by the Dutch and his rebellion against the colonial power is defeated. And you can see ladies weeping there. Because of the defeat of the Javanese. This is actually the final challenge against Dutch colonial rule. It ends in 1830. So Diponegoro is a Javanese prince, rebels against Dutch colonial power, the last major rebellion from 1825 to 1830 against the Dutch. But Diponegoro has very extensive credentials. He is educated in Islamic boarding school, is a member of the nobility, and is also imbued with powers of Javanese mysticism. His rebellion actually mobilized the peasants, but the peasants also rebel against taxation, heavy taxation. So you see a situation of a local ruler who appeals to the local population for support against the foreign element, making use of the unjust taxation as well. The second case study is from the peasants' revolt of Banten, and I jump another 50 years, 1888. Actually a very famous thesis that all Indonesians know, the study of the Banten revolt. Banten is an area here in the, as you can see, the corner there of Java, here. A rural area, a little bit economically left behind. This gentleman here, my old professor actually in Gajah Mada University, called Sartono Kartotirtjo, is a very famous scholar who did his PhD in the Netherlands, and he actually wrote that book, The Banten Rebellion. And in his work he saw a similar connection. So campaign against colonial ruler, use of a holy war, and promises of abolition of taxes and foundation of an Islamic state as an appeal to the population and the peasants. The peasants in these cases use Islam as a driver against oppression and as a rallying factor to join the masses together. So the elements that can be discerned in cases of mass religious violence in the 19th century are struggle against injustice, rallying behind the messianic leader, and also economic motives. The second case that I will use is the case of Sarekat Islam. And here in the middle you see a famous Islamic leader, Cokro Aminoto, one of the leading heroes of Indonesia, actually an important figure for Islam. Sarekat Islam in 1912 had about 40,000 members in Solo, and the group originally was a merchant based, trying to break the Chinese Indonesian or the Chinese monopoly of trade, and then gradually they mobilized Islam in order to group the indigenous people together. And basically there, the anti-colonial leadership attempts to harness the energy of religious violence caused by exploitation of the 19th century and focus on a central leader. We can now see that in the 20th century, political parties emerged that tried to harness that same political power in order to grow. So Sarekat Islam is the example of that. The early years it shows a limited Islamic activism and more merchant interests, and then gradually it evolves. So it would seem that Sarekat Islam was more or less open to various indigenous people who used it as in a way to organize in larger groups, and most of this energy was directed against the Chinese. I call them the Chinese Indonesians actually now. The tensions between the two groups were central to the conflict. So by the early 1920s, Sarekat Islam gained more political ambition, and this was distinction from other forms of anti-colonial political groups. Then an issue emerged. As you can see, there's a red here and there's a green, so it's not like blue and green in Taiwan, but there is red and green. And it's basically the same Sarekat Islam, and they call that the Sarekat Islam Hijau and the Sarekat Islam Merah, the red and the green. Basically what happened is Sarekat Islam was gradually infiltrated by communist-leaning elements. So communist agitators or communist political leaders tried to make use of Islam and tried to make use of the mass movements to gain political strength. And this is actually already my argument there. So, forward. Okay, there we go. And here you can see there was actually already by that Chokro Aminoto, a person that I mentioned, the leader, he also already acknowledged that Islam was very much connected to socialism, in the sense that Islam had a care and desire to care for the social well-being of the ordinary people. And these two fellows, Semaun and Darsono, were the communist propagandists who joined the movement. So there was actually in the elite, there was a genuine discussion of what direction to take. And some people were leading more toward Islam, others were leading more toward communism, some also were leading towards nationalism. And they formed then the Partai Komunis Indonesia, the Communist Party of Indonesia, 1920s. So Islam was an important identity marker of the Javanese, but it seems that the religious violence was in fact more clearly due to a group of political agitators who used religion and the ethnicity in order to recruit sympathizers for political agitation. So the conflict ran so deep that the Islamic elements of the Sarekat Islam discarded those communist elements who wanted to stir up and mobilize the population against the colonial authorities. So what happened then? The colonial authorities basically crushed the communists. But although they were technically crushed, you can see that just after World War II ends, they immediately re-emerge and they become one of the strongest factions of Indonesia. So crushed in the 1920s, it's actually debatable because they did continue to have their networks underground. Islamic parties, on the other hand, they continued to be part of the political spectrum as well as the nationalist parties. So political parties and elites recognized the importance of the fact that religion of the masses as a power or as a tool to use for political action. The importance of Islam as a recruitment tool was recognized, but this was not sufficient to mobilize people, and the actual defense of Islam was not an argument that was used. The fight against oppression was what the communist also would try to rally behind. And the next case that I used is the Japanese era in Java. It starts in March 42, since the Japanese only reached Java in March 42 until August 45. So Japanese had a very tight grip on Indonesian society, and they suppressed all political expressions of political leadership. Where in the Dutch era you could have political parties, you did not have that under the Japanese. So various political leaders were able to act against the wishes of the Dutch, but in the Japanese time they had to listen. And one big example there is the future president of Indonesia, this fellow over here, Sukarno, and you can actually see him there with his costume trying to recruit Romusha, which is a forced laborers, to work for the Japanese. So Sukarno, who was an example of the non-cooperation movement, trying to say we do not want to work with the colonial authorities, had to basically do what the Japanese said. Why? Because otherwise he would have been killed and tortured. Tortured, of course, right? So it really didn't have much choice. The Japanese basically tried to mobilize the Indonesians, and they had this AAA movement and various other movements, but this one is so the light of Cahaya Asia, I put that in there because there are some Chinese or Japanese characters that we could maybe read. The light of Asia is Japan, Nippon, right? The Pelindung, the defender of Asia, is also Japan, and the leader of Asia is again Japan. Japan, right? And it was called the AAA movement because Churchill had come up with the V. So they said, let's just turn it around and make it into an A. That was the AAA movement. So actually the Japanese were very much fearful of communism, but they were also recognized that that Islam was a very important power to reckon with. So what they tried to do was to mobilize the Indonesians, and they used Islam for that. But it is true that the Japanese were also not totally comfortable about the power of Islam. So we can see that, because what they did was they created Islamic militias only in 1944. And that was more than a year after the nationalist Pembela Tanah Air, the defenders of the motherland, was for the more nationalist group was formed. So the Pembela Tanah Air were founded in the 3rd of October 43, and only in 15 December 44 did they found the Hezbollah. So the Japanese were a bit more cautious about Islam. They wanted to use it, but they also knew that it could be like a tiger that could bite them instead of fighting their enemies. And here you can see that the top part here is the PETA army, and you can see the symbol of Islam there used to an extent in that as well, because of course Islam was very much against the more Christian Dutch. And here you have the Hezbollah group with their symbol. They were actually very small militia, about a few tens of thousands. But they would become very important after the war, because all the people who had received military training would then, of course, train more Indonesians. And so the National Army of Indonesia is actually made up of these three different groups. You have the nationalists, you have some Islamists, and you have also formerly a colonial military, which is actually the most important group, but that's another discussion. So the Japanese had actively tried to woo the Islamic segment of the population, but they were actually quite ambivalent about that, because they forced the Islamic leaders in Indonesia to outwardly express support for Japan. And that was difficult, because for instance, the Islamic leaders, they had to bow towards the emperor and no longer to Mecca, which also was not really something that worked well. But despite the Japanese policies, there was still resistance. One big important case is in Tasikmalaya. You had Haji Zain al-Mustafa and his pesantren in Islamic boarding school resisted the Japanese. So basically we can say Japan completely failed to mobilize Islam for itself, but did succeed in creating a virulent strain in Indonesian society that would use Islam as a political motivator. And they paired that with this Japanese instructed glorification of system-authorized violence. So basically I'm arguing that it becomes a political tool, more so than under the Dutch era, because of the Japanese training. So this was different from what had occurred in the 19th century, and the Dutch controlled first decades of the 20th century. In the 19th century, what do we see? We have indigenous elites using the grievances of the peasants to cloak themselves in Islam, to mobilize those peasants largely for their own benefit. The Dutch controlled decades of the 20th century. What do we see there? You have the elite takes another form, in the form of political parties and political leadership, and this segment tries to appeal to the general population. That is, of course, I should have started out with that, 87% of the population in Indonesia nowadays is still a Muslim. So of course you can recruit, that's the segment you want to recruit. The communists also try to recruit in that same group, because Islam and communism had very similar, ironically, very similar appeal to the ordinary folks, because they try to improve the social conditions of the poor people. So Muslim population remained very susceptible to this because of the conditions of poverty it experienced. Mass mobilization was also not a total success because of the different strains in Indonesian political society, all vying to recruit from the same bond of political followers. During the Japanese era, however, something fundamentally changed. Now, for the first time, violence was taught and sanctioned by an authority. And the albeit reluctant recruitment of Muslims in the militia for the first time, combined with the anger with military training and religion, yet without a clear leadership because of the defeat of the Japanese. This would become a problem that spilled over in the Indonesian era of the independent Indonesian Republic. And this is, for instance, the case of Darul Islam, right? Darul means house, the house of Islam, by a famous person called Kartosuwirjo. Kartosuwirjo was one of the students of Cokro Aminoto, all the way back. Chokro Milano from Sarekat Islam, and he was also an important figure, but he sort of falls out of the government. So he creates his own movement, and eventually a break with the nationalists leads to a rebellion, the Muslim Rebellion of Darul Islam. What happens is in this area here, the same mountain area that I mentioned before. So the issue of course now is that there is no longer this colonial enemy. So Kartu Suhirjo and various other groups that refuse the Indonesian Republic, they all end up losing. Not just the Muslim group, you also have several people here in the south of Maluku. They are more Christian, and they form the Republic of the South Maluku. And you have people from Papua later who also don't accept the national state. But the state ends up winning because of the numbers. So the interesting element here is that Islam is now no longer used against the colonial power, but against the same nationalist power it once joined forces with, against the national power, the colonial power. So the factionalism that occurred in the Indonesian independence movement returned in the post-war era, where by lack of a joint enemy, these various segments in society start to lose connection or connectivity. So concluding, so there's a clear correlation between the economics, Islamic politics and violence, where there is a strong messianic leader who takes over. Indonesian political parties try to recruit people, but interestingly enough, in the Dutch era, the Sarekat Islam is not that effective. Another interesting element is that the Sarekat Islam case clearly shows that there is a difficulty for political parties to recruit active Muslim scholars. The Japanese will use Islam and emotions to fire up the Islamic population, and this creates a revitalization of a militancy that does not shun violence. During the Japanese occupation, there's a genuine anger at the treatment of civilians. There's no real leadership, but it's easy to recruit people to act against the enemy of Japan. Finally, the post-war era, it becomes clear that many rebel groups have established themselves, but that the Indonesian army can counter all these revolutionary groups. And then my final slide. So the shadow side here is that the potential for organized mass violence in the early post-war era is higher, simply because the Japanese influenced Indonesian mentality, and these groups trained, are now willing to fight for what they believe in. Islamic groups were originally used by the Japanese to struggle against the colonial state. However, they now direct their violence at the Indonesian state. And that's a Muslim-dominated religious state and various other organizations. So the correlation between violence, religion, and politics seems therefore only applicable when emotions take control of population. There's a degree of irrationality and irony that now that Indonesia is an independent country, there's more violence against the government by Muslim activists than there ever was when Indonesia was less free. This clearly shows that violence is either outburst or a systematically used tool for political means to an end. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. I think we really worked in very hard this morning. Two papers, they're both very well connected and very interesting. Now, the last speaker for this panel is Professor Xuanyuan Chiu, who I call Thomas. Xuanyuan is a academic faculty member at the Department of Sociology in National Tsinghua University in Taipei. And again, he's a very long-time friend. He was the first person who introduced me to the academic scene in Taiwan. And of course, my paper yesterday on religious multiculturalism was very much inspired by Xuanyuan, who used the term for the first time 10 years ago in his paper in Euroseas. Look forward to his presentation on struggling to build a righteous Muslim community, Islamic populism in contemporary Indonesian Muslim politics.
Okay. Good morning to everybody, and many thanks for your invitation again. I think later I will present my topic bilingually. Also consider the background of the audience. Before my presentation, I would say a few words to the initiation of this conference. I remember that last year, Professor Van Bosch came across to me in Zhenzi University. And he told me that he wanted to organize a conference regarding religious violence. But at that time, it was pity that Zhengda is not so interested in this topic. I don't know why. So I'm very happy. Later we moved to Professor Ma Biolin, and Zhengda is so kind, so open to continue and carry out this conference. And then I just find out there are more key words in the topic of a seminar. Because last year only religious violence, now we get one more key word regarding multiculturalism. I think it's quite important. Because 2 weeks ago, I was invited to South Kalimantan to stay at Islamic University to give two speech. The first topic is about Indonesian Muslim community in Taiwan. And I feel that people are very happy about what happened in Taiwan, and also happy about to know the development or the spread of Indonesian Muslim community here. But I got some difficult question in my second presentation in that university. My topic is to introduce my dissertation about the Chinese and Indonesian convert to Islam. But after I finish my talk, some people like to ask me questions regarding the rise of China and also the relation between Indonesia and China. One of the questions is quite provoking regarding, do you think the head of Chinese are always trying to dominate and colonize other countries? And I reply that I'm not so sure, because there are so many Chinese in the world. And we Taiwan also suffer in this situation. Even so, I cannot, I want to join the people to criticize China, the rise of China. And it is so interesting that at that time I really feel that One Belt One Road really makes some Southeast Asia country feel unhappy. Anyway, so let me move to my topic. I think one thing I'm always very careful, in particular when I teach Islam in university, I avoid to talk political Islam in the beginning of my course, because it's not good for my student to have a good understanding about Islam. So, but anyway, why I talk this topic is because later I will talk a very interesting case regarding the Chinese-Indonesia politician, Ahok. His Chinese name is Zhong Wanjue. Because he got some trouble during his post as governor of Jakarta. And his news is so attractive among the Chinese world, probably because of his ethnic background. But that's why I'm going to write a Chinese article. Why I'm going to do that is because that I find that the local concern among Chinese community always focus on that, because he is a Chinese minority, Christian minority. That's why he has something called discrimination in Indonesia. Okay? And I have to apologize that I didn't really prepare a very good PPT, like Frank Dong. So many interesting photos and pictures. I highly appreciate that. I didn't do that. I feel very sorry. Okay, so the first issue is about the Muslim democracy in Indonesia and the conservative turn. The background is that since 1998, there is a rapid transformation in Indonesia, and this country is usually considered as the third largest democratic country, even a kind of democratic Muslim country. 也就是说，它被当成是一个模范生，特别是前几年， 它经常被拿来跟土耳其做比较，但土耳其自从发生政变以后，再也没有人想要把它放在跟印尼比较了。所以印尼当然是这个世界上大家在心目中一个很好的一个穆斯林民主国家。Okay? But what happened is now that although in Indonesia Islamic Party haven't become a major party and the Indonesian Muslim majority feel reluctant to support ideas such as kind of Islamic state. However, the democratization in 1998 lifted the restriction on Islamic organization to operate publicly. 也就是说，印尼它不像别的中东国家有很多比较激进的伊斯兰政党，后来透过国会大选真的得到政权，或者变成主要执政党。我觉得这个国家并没有这样一个麻烦，而且大部分的穆斯林也觉得，社会可以被伊斯兰化，但是政治跟国家不需要这样子做。但是问题就是说，98年呢，开始民主化以后，因为这个民主化是对所有社会成员开放的，所以这些保守的穆斯林团体它也得到机会开始发展。OK， but actually it's not new for politicians in the state to use gangsters, militias, and organized violent groups to repress political opponents. 但是问题就是说，这个国家它以前